Shackleton was a leader who was made, not born, and he was made in very large part by two previous expeditions that he had made to Antarctica under two different sets of circumstances. The first was at the early turn of the century, the 19th into the 20th century. He, under the command of Robert Falcon Scott, a well-known British naval commander, he and several other men traveled to the Antarctic continent in an attempt to be the first team of men to discover the South Pole. That voyage taught Shackleton a lot about what weak leadership looked like. Scott was weak. He was indecisive. He was insecure. He wanted his men to like him more than he wanted to achieve his mission, which included, very importantly, the safety of his men. So Shackleton learned a lot about what great leadership was not, reminding all of us that we can learn from other individuals as we make ourselves into good leaders, partly by negative example. The second voyage that very much affected the making of Ernest Shackleton was a voyage that he himself captained. It was an amazing journey, and Shackleton and his small team got close to the pole, the closest that any group had ever gotten, 97 miles north, when Shackleton realized that his men were too weak to complete the trip to the South Pole and get back safely. And so he turned away, a wrenching decision. And as he said later to his wife, better a live donkey than a dead lion. So there he learned the critical importance of looking out for the safety of his men and of looking ahead from what would it cost him and his men, even though they'd get to the South Pole, if they never got back. Shackleton's most famous expedition, and the one we're going to concentrate on now, is the Endurance expedition, which began in August 1914 when the team left London for the Antarctic continent. On their way to the Antarctic continent, Shackleton and his men sail into an island for their last outpost. It's called South Georgia, deep in the South Atlantic. The whalers and sailors there warn him that the icebergs are unusually far north this year, and that if he and his men sail south, they may face danger and hazards as a result of a sea that is literally ridden with ice floes. Shackleton makes the decision almost immediately to sail on despite the risk. By January 1915, they can see the Antarctic coast. It's about 80 miles away. And then ice forms around the ship. Big bergs form around the ship and lock together like a vice. And the Endurance and its 28 inhabitants is absolutely stuck. And suddenly, everything is very different. And the mission, walk across the Antarctic continent, is now up for grabs. And last but not least, it's summer, the days are long, and the men who were supposed to be setting up base camp and getting ready for this astounding expedition are confronted with endless time and all that might mean. It's interesting to note that he focused a huge amount of his attention as the leader on affecting the engagement, the outlook, and the cohesion of his team. He immediately set about putting together a whole host of activities and, in some cases, precedents for his men to follow in now these very changed circumstances in which it looked like the mission of the expedition was now called into question, or maybe even over. First, he ordered that every man come together for an hour after dinner in the stateroom to socialize. Talk, play games, compare notes, engage in theatricals. They were going to come together and they were going to enjoy each other's company, and they were not going to be off alone in their bunks thinking about how miserable their situation was. One day he decided to have a waltzing contest on the ice, and he was the lead-off dancer. And there was a wonderful afternoon of rating the waltzing skills of his men. He had dog races across the ice. He was constantly thinking about how to keep his men engaged, focused on the positive, and working together. Some of this was an attempt, right, that wouldn't have been lost on his men to keep the hours, now long days, because we're in the middle of the Southern Hemisphere summer, keep most of it was about something even more important. It was about what Shackleton referred to during the expedition as creating mental medicine, cohesion, things he could do or order his men to do that would make them feel like they were doing productive, enjoyable, upward-looking things with their time and their abilities. And he used that image over and over and over as a critical resource in leading and managing the 27 men that were his team. The real point is that mental medicine, managing the energy and outlook and engagement, and particularly the cohesion of your team, is at least as valuable, and perhaps more valuable, than any other resource that a leader has. In Shackleton's case, it was more valuable than the food supply. It was more important to his team's survival and success than the temperatures on the ice and then the oncoming specter of the Antarctic winter. How do we know that? How can we know that about our own leadership today? We know that because when we stop to consider what happens if the leader does not pay careful, consistent attention to the energy of his men, of his women, of his team, it is inevitable that a downward spiral sets in. Ennui, which could easily have become the weather front over these men in these circumstances, can become boredom. Boredom can become disbelief and despair. Despair and dissension can easily then, in high-stakes situations, become death. Let's picture Ernest Shackleton. The ship is stuck in the ice. Outwardly, we can see that he's confident, sanguine, interested in each man, intensely engaged in the work of managing his team's energy. Inwardly, he is increasingly concerned for the ship's survival amid the ice floes. Because what's happening beginning in our summer, the winter now, in the Southern Hemisphere, say June 1915, is that vice, those big icebergs in which the ship is stuck, are slowly beginning to crush the ship. The men are still living on the ship, but they can hear the timbers starting to be strained. By August 1915, the ship is visibly foundering because the ice has it so tightly locked that it's now at about a 50-degree angle with the flat surface of the ice. Shackleton is making plans to have the men abandon ship. At the same time, winter is arriving. The days are getting darker, temperatures are plummeting, and the ship keeps getting buffeted by that vice. Shackleton tells a couple of confidants in midwinter that what the ice gets, the ice keeps. Meaning, if the ship is damaged further, they will have to abandon it, and it will eventually be claimed by the sea and by the ice. He's worried, and he paces the ice, trying to think about not the original mission, how we're going to walk across the continent, but how. If we lose the ship, and it looks increasingly likely that they will, how will my men survive, and how will I lead them to survival? And most important in that context, how will I help them believe they can survive? His men don't see that during the course of the day. He's confident, he's doing the daily things, he's managing and leading all the time, but he's nervous. The men abandon the ship in September 1915. They put up tents, they take the lifeboats, they grab all the resources, food, stores that they can from the now cracking, very damaged ship. And the ship is left, mast broken, there, as the men begin to make a kind of crude camp. They live there for 2 months, and in November 1915, one day, Shackleton says, "She's going, boys!" And the men watch as in 9 hours, the Endurance slides through the ice and the ice closes over. There is literally no line on the horizon for anyone, including Ernest Shackleton, to see. That night, in his diary, he writes, "The Endurance sank today. I cannot write about it." In the wake of the Endurance sliding through the ice and disappearing from view, Shackleton has a critical realization that he holds to for a great length of time. And that is that his mission and the mission of his team has fundamentally changed. And what that means is that he must change his leadership. he must grow into the leader capable of dealing now with this much worse crisis. He writes in his diary that a man must shape himself to a new mark the minute the old one goes aground. Think about what he's saying. He's saying, the finish line has changed. The goalposts are different. I've got to raise my game and develop the kind of leadership that is required to meet these new increasing challenges. Shackleton also understands, very much in relation to this, what all leaders need to come to know, which is that in order to do that, he has to keep meeting with himself about how he's going to do this. Because one thing is very, very obvious to him, and that is, I may not know as the leader exactly how we're going to steer toward the new mission. Shackleton wants his men to survive, but he doesn't know step by step exactly how he's going to do that. And the turbulence and volatility of his circumstances make that almost impossible. So what does that mean for his meetings with himself, for his making of himself into a new, even stronger, more resilient, more capable leader? It means that he has to be committed to the idea, to the notion that his leadership and management will involve constant adaptation, suppleness, improvisation, flexibility. He will maintain his abiding, deep commitment to the mission. I will get them all home alive. But how he does that, moment by moment, day by day, in the short run, in the longer run, will have a lot of flexibility and adaptability. The second thing that he understands, critical to accomplishing his mission, I will bring them all home alive, is he has to convince the crew that individually and collectively, they can do that. And that they, under his guidance, under his orders, under his leadership, are going to do that. He has to maintain the credibility of the mission with his men. At the same time, he's juggling, like all leaders, a number of balls in the air at all times. He has to continue to manage the energy of the men. And that means something very interesting, as it does for all teams in the context of turbulence. That means he also has to manage the people that are potentially disruptors, potentially great doubters, potentially capable of spreading doubt and dissension and negativity. And Shackleton takes up this challenge with great commitment and great execution. And what he does is, at its simplest, most fundamental level, is back to the old adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So Shackleton does something right away after the ship goes down. He brings all the men, he thinks, 4 of them, that are doubting Thomases, disruptors, dissenters, into his tent, so they will share his tent with them. He takes very special care to keep them on board. He keeps a close eye on them, because what he does not want, what he cannot have, and all leaders understand this with a big mission, he cannot have those doubters, those disruptors, spreading the negativity and doubt and dissension that they themselves feel. So, managing group and individual energy has an additional piece to it. You have to make sure that the enemies of the change, of the mission, of the great achievement are managed so that they do not in any way take the mission off course.